While the cost of action will be great, I can assure you that the cost of inaction will be far greater.
The COVID relief bill known as the American Rescue Plan, the sweeping $1.9 trillion package that will include cash payouts to many Americans.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
So this video is for macroeconomics, and it's looking at fiscal policy and the reasons why the government sometimes has to increase their public spending. And it also looks at why sometimes the government should operate with a budget deficit. And it's based on the crowding-in effect. So the crowding-in effect occurs when high government spending leads to an increase in private sector investment. So the crowding-in effect occurs because high government spending leads to an accelerator, encouraging firms to invest because there are now more profitable investment opportunities. So in other words, the crowding-in effect would take place when the economy is operating at a negative output gap. And in a negative output gap, there'd be a lack of confidence in the economy. So because of that lack of confidence, private sector investment would be weak, as firms would not see any incentive in investing when they're not utilising their full capacity at that present time. So if they're not utilising their full capacity at that present time, why would they invest to expand on that capacity? And when obviously investment is low, if the government is able to therefore increase their expenditure and their public sector investment, then that might help to increase confidence, and that confidence then can cause multipliers and start to accelerate private sector investment. At that point, the government can start to reduce how much they're spending and allow the private sector spending to take over. So let's see some examples.
Britain had been in a slump for years. Classical economists said that if workers would just agree to wage cuts, businessmen would invest again, create jobs, and the economy would revive. But Keynes disagreed. He thought the way to recovery was being blocked by pessimism or low animal spirits.
The big insight of Keynes behind all of this was that a market economy is not self-stabilizing. And when you get very big changes in animal spirits, in sentiment, where people who are producing to sell in the future suddenly worry that actually maybe there won't be the demand in the future, so they stop producing.
When you cut back government spending in a situation such as a recession or depression, demand goes down, unemployment goes up, and it's a vicious circle. Confidence isn't restored when unemployment goes up, and when business goes down, confidence is eroded.
Across the Colorado River, bordering Nevada and Arizona, it was the biggest construction project in the world.
I would call it a Keynesian project, absolutely. The government stepped in with money, built a deficit. And out of that came Hoover Dam, which gave thousands, tens of thousands of people a new life, money to spend.
Armies of workers from across America tunneled for 5 years through mile upon mile of mountain rock to build what was in effect a vast power generator, providing electricity for huge swathes of the country.
It primed the economy. A $165 million investment which produced billions in growth, economic growth.
After the crash in 2008, the world seemed to be running out of cash. But rather than cut back, governments spent huge amounts of money they didn't have. Why on earth would they do that? What he realised was economies might sink and then not automatically float back up. Looking around the Western economies today, that does sound a bit familiar. And the crisis of 2008 was the biggest emergency anyone had seen for a long time. When the global financial system crashed, the world faced the real possibility of another Great Depression. Governments have been preaching the free market for years. But faced with this economic disaster, they reached again for the old Keynesian levers.
It was a classic Keynesian response. When individuals stopped spending money and when businesses stopped spending money, if the government also stops spending money at the same time, then what happens? The economy basically crashes.
The aim was to boost confidence, or animal spirits, by making it easier to borrow, invest and spend. A slice of the government's £2.4 billion fund to help regional growth and employment. They want to show me what the company's really all about. Pirelli's one of the world's biggest tyre makers. It's been manufacturing in Britain for almost a century. It wants to develop some of its top ranges and beef up research and development. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But the sums hadn't been adding up. This factory is one of Carlisle's biggest employers. There are about 750 workers here, producing 10,000 tyres a day. Not so long ago, people worried the company would shift production overseas to cut costs. A £2 million government grant has persuaded Pirelli to invest in Britain instead.
When we have a major investment, the confidence in people to spend their wages is increased and the local economy benefits. And it's not only Pirelli employees. We have hundreds of suppliers and contractors who depend on this factory, and they benefit also when Pirelli increases its spend, and also they recycle that money into the local economy.
It might seem surprising, a handout to a private company when the government's so worried about the mounting national debt, now more than £1 trillion. But Keynes was quite clear. There are times when we need to step in to make capitalism work for us, even when that means spending money we don't have. Keynes might have died almost 7 decades ago, but out here in the Arizona desert, his big idea for getting the economy moving again lives on. At Gila Bend, they're building the biggest solar power plant of its kind in the world. The site covers over 3.5 square miles. Nearly 1 million mirrors will capture enough energy to provide 70,000 American homes with clean power. But for the people in this remote region, and for John Maynard Keynes, probably the most important thing this plant will produce is employment.
Between my wife and I, we probably spent 2 years out of work. Thank God, not at the same time, but we took some very significant hits. Company that sources our manpower tells me they receive 300 resumes per day. There's a lot of people looking for work, and the people who have jobs out here feel very lucky to have their jobs.
In effect, this plant is part of a vast Keynesian experiment. In the wake of the crash, the US government stumped up $750 billion for projects like this one to create jobs and growth. In normal times, say the people who run this site, they would have raised the $1.5 billion to get things going from commercial banks. But these aren't normal times.
Because of that downturn, we had to look for alternative sources of financing. And of course, in this context, the federal loan guarantee program here in the US has helped it out a lot. In fact, without that kind of public programs, this plant would have never been.
So as we could see from those examples, the government spending helped to stimulate and generate employment and therefore private sector spending. So macroeconomic theories such as chartalism and this post-Keynesian viewpoint is that government borrowing in a modern economy that is operating significantly below capacity can actually increase demand by generating employment, thereby stimulating private spending. Now, I thought what was really interesting about the example in America, when Obama obviously carried out that stimulus package, was you had those private sector companies that said that this project would not have gone ahead if it wasn't for the government. And the reason for that is because there was just no incentive for them to do so. They were worried about cash flow, they were worried about their liquidity, they were worried about the return on that investment, and therefore there was no incentive for them to do so. But by the government helping them, then that obviously gave them the go-ahead to actually be more confident in doing so. That would generate employment. By generating employment, we'd start to see the multiplier, where obviously those, because there was a high level of labour that was employed for just that one government scheme, but obviously there was other government schemes at that time, and other types of capital expenditure. They would obviously use that income, and if there was that marginal propensity to consume would start to increase, and that would multiply in the economy, generating revenue for firms and starting to build that confidence. As soon as the private sector sees confidence rising in the economy and higher animal spirits, then they are going to start to increase their spending. Now, the crowding effect is not meant to be one of those theories where it just suggests that government spending should always be on the rise. The whole point of the crowding effect is that once the government spends, it helps to obviously generate growth. It's an injection into national income, but then it stimulates private sector spending. And as soon as private sector spending becomes stronger and we see more investment, then actually we don't really need the government to continue with that spending. It's just there to help with the output gap.